You know, this is a brand new show, and so often here at Sideline Sports, we always talk about what happens on the court, on the field, stats, players, impact, games, you name it. But there isn't really a show out there that talks about off the court. Well, there's plenty over on the South Florida Tribune, but that's another story. Now I'm talking about the business aspect of things, and every now and again we do have some off court, off field topics and everything. But when it comes to the business aspect, there wasn't really any education about it, and that's why I'm here with this guy Sean Russey for our new show, Sports Business Insider. We talk about the business aspect. Today's topic is going to talk about draft pick trading and draft revenue and more. Now, just last week we just had the NFL draft. And those of you who are confused about a couple of things, especially concerning the number one overall draft pick, Caleb Williams, well, we're here to give you a little bare bones, down to the bare bones and skeleton of things. But before we get started, just want to let you all know that you can check us out on Facebook, Instagram, X, YouTube, and LinkedIn as well. Also, we are on at a special night tonight. Usually we're on Wednesdays, but tonight only we're on Tuesday night tonight, of course. But with that being said, and it being Tuesday, coming up next after this, right after this show, is going to be the Sideline Sports Show. I'm going to be talking about the NFL playoffs. Excuse me, I'm sorry, NBA playoffs. They're not NFL yet. Come on, but it's going to be the NBA playoffs. Had some exciting games, exciting endings the last 2 days. Got a great game going on right now with Philadelphia and New York. New York looking to close out the series and everything. And then, of course, a lot more talk. It's going to be some NHL thrown in there. Dave's probably going to roar and rant about something. So you definitely got to tune in for that. Also, on Mondays, you got the only and the hottest pro wrestling show on the net, and that is Top Rope Talk with myself and the wrestling professor Billy Cruz. Those are on Mondays at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Take a look at yesterday's episode. We had Rafael Esparza on, the greatest odds maker that money can buy. And he was on giving not only a few NBA picks, but also we just had to throw that in there. But for WWE Backlash France coming up and some betting odds in Vegas as far as who's going to win. Also tonight, right after the Sideline Sports Show, it's Hawk Talk with David DeRocher and Walter Thurman. It's going to be at 10:30 Eastern Standard Time. So, all right, that's enough advertising for today. Let's go ahead and get to it. Sean, how you doing, buddy?
It's going good, Denzel. How's it going tonight?
Pretty good, pretty good. So, we just had this big draft last week and everything. I know some people heard some things and kind of dismissed it, but maybe it was in the back of their mind, like, man, what do they mean by this? I know you wanted to touch on draft pick trading. So, tell us a little bit about how that works.
Yeah, and I just wanted to touch on it briefly because I know a lot of fans, when they see the dropbacks, they don't really understand why. Well, why did you get, you gave up one pick, but you gained two way back later in the draft. And it's not set in stone. It's nothing the NFL says you have to do it this way. But when Jimmy Johnson was the coach of the Cowboys, he came up with a draft pick value system, which has changed a little bit, but according to Bill Belichick, is still based on the foundation of the Jimmy Johnson system. And he put a point system for each draft pick, starting with number one, who is valued in his system at 3,000 points. But immediately the number two pick is already down to like 2,500 points, and the drops continue, all the way through the seventh round. And what teams have done now is essentially they've memorized this chart, studied it. All the teams use the same chart, and they trade the players and the value of these picks within 5, 10, maybe at maximum 15% of what this value chart lays out. And that's why when sometimes you'll see a team get 4 draft picks for maybe just one, you'll give up 4 draft picks for one in return. It's because they looked at this chart and they said, yeah, the value makes sense here. And other times, it's because teams want to reach. I think Trey Lance is a good example. I think if you probably looked at the Jimmy Johnson chart and the little curves they've made to it over the years, I think the Niners probably reached on that one, but they felt they really wanted their guy. And that's one of the examples where the 15% was probably exceeded if you look at the chart on that specific trade.
Right. Huh. Okay. Then, and then of course it didn't end up working how they thought because, well, come to find out, Jimmy G was still serviceable, and then there's that Brock Purdy guy. So it was one of those things, and we talked about it on the Gauntlet miles ago. Is it was one of those deals where they just had to kind of eat it up because Trey Lance got hurt, Jimmy G got hurt and got inserted back in, and then Brock Purdy just kind of took off. It's like, well, shoot, do you give Trey Lance the job back? You just mortgage the future on this dude.
Yeah, and they were really fortunate because it's one of those things where they could have had been set back for years and years, depending what Lance actually pans out to be. Given the little sample size, not to get up too far off topic, the little bit of sample size that Lance has shown us has not been great, and definitely not the value of what the Niners gave up to get him.
Hmm. So in the end, they end up. Well, they do have the guy that took them to a Super Bowl and almost won it. So there's that. I guess you can
Yep,
kind of eat it a bit. And let's face it, any day now, Brock Purdy's going to get his money. It's a foregone conclusion.
absolutely.
So
And
so with that
on
being
that, the draft now brings in ridiculous revenue. Way back when, even though it was a 2-day deal on ESPN, it was not bringing in the revenue it brings in now.
right,
And really, the NFL's capitalized on making this, a year-round festival for fans. Essentially, there's not really a whole lot of downtime, even after the Super Bowl. And last year's draft, the city of Kansas City got 165 million dollars, influx from all, the fans that come in and the money the NFL puts into it. This year, it's estimated to be 175 to 200 million dollars.
oh wow,
And other sports obviously they go pretty heavy with their drafts as well, but I think the NFL's really you know gotten this down to a science to be a year-round sport, even with an off season.
hmm, yeah, and and to think, KC had just won a Super Bowl, and then boom, they get the draft. So yeah,
Yeah,
it's insane, man. It's pretty crazy. So, but you know what? And shout out to the city of Detroit. Our guys from Sideline Sports were down there. John Shear was down there. Shout out to Ray J. Lynn. He was there as well. And it was a great turnout. It was a really, really great turnout. I know that I'm actually waiting to hear what the numbers were for Detroit. I know something like 270,000 fans were in attendance in total. So who knows how much money like that's going to turn out to be.
yeah, and that exceeded the attendance in Kansas City last year. So the estimate's 175 to 200. And you can imagine the NFL will continue to grow this thing. They'll find other ways to get even more numbers to the draft. And I think the circulating of the cities has had a huge impact on the draft, just becoming this huge spectacle for them. It's not as big as the Super Bowl, obviously, with Media Week and all this, but they've made it to the point where it's very profitable for the city that gets it.
It is. It is absolutely. So, with that being said, we'll go on to our next point here because I know you've got some points on this one. So, the number one overall draft pick, Caleb Williams. So it had actually been this. This is not really like news. Um, this came out about a couple of months ago, or actually it's more than that. That he wasn't going to have an agent. You know, and well, he gets drafted, and then now it's kind of coming back up and people are probably wondering. Of course, everyone's gonna have their speculation as far as oh, he's not getting an agent. Some were like, oh, well, he's stupid, and this, like just some of the many takes that you get amongst the fan base. But he's actually saving money by foregoing an agent, and how so? Go ahead.
Yeah, so on the forefront, it actually does look that way. They that he's saving some money. Honestly, on the first deal, most agents for the first pick overall would do it at one or sign the first pick overall, because what that would do for an agent and his agency or just his stature alone, it's almost like, okay, we won this by just signing the number one overall guy, so we're not going to charge him. Now the downside for Williams, he's not getting a charge, but he had to come out of pocket for his own training, which probably was in excess of $20,000, $30,000, maybe even more.
For his own training, you
That
said?
for his own combine training.
Ah,
Um, where if he had an agent in play, an agent more than likely would have paid for that. Now, obviously, the commission would come into play there, and there'd probably be an offset, but it would be a difference of him probably not coming out of pocket. Now, he has a lot of NIL money. It may not have been a big decision for him to pay for his own training and still forego the agent route. And on the first contract, he can probably get away with it because it is slotted by the CBA. He's essentially knows what he's getting by being the number one overall draft pick. There's a
Hmm.
little bit of negotiation to be had there in terms of finer points if there's any some language that the Bears want to stick in there if there's any injury protections and whatnot. But it's really the second contract that has to be negotiated, in my opinion, by an agent.
That's the biggest one.
Um,
Typically,
yeah,
amongst athletes, it's the biggest one, especially in football.
Yeah, and and that's we've seen some players go the route of doing it themselves, and some of them have gotten really good deals. Lamar
Mhm.
Jackson, even though it took longer than if he had an agent, I don't think the deal would have taken as long because there would have been more leverage in play. Um, I think an agent, obviously Lamar's on the field, he can't work, as long as an agent would have in terms of working the phones and getting some leverage and being able to kind of press the Ravens this way or that way, and
Mhm.
maybe getting an offer on the table. I think that's kind of where the disconnect was. What like, well, I don't need an agent because I'm going to get my deal done, and that's true. But it probably wouldn't have taken nearly as long. And I think again he would have had some more leverage if he had some representation.
Hmm.
On the flip side, there's also been bad deals by players that haven't had an agent. Richard Sherman, who negotiated his own deal with 49ers, who we just discussed previously, he ended up signing a deal that only was 3 million guaranteed and 36 million in bonuses. I think
Oh,
he ended up collecting maybe 10 to 15 million in those bonuses total over his few years there with the 49ers. Um, but that's a situation, especially given his name stature. If he had an agent, he probably would have walked away with more guaranteed money. Um, and lessen the incentive side versus the deal he did sign, which was essentially turned out to a 1 year, $7 million deal
yeah.
the first year around with the incentives he earned. And I think those are just two examples where you can see it worked in Lamar's favor, but it took longer than it should have. It did not work in Sherman's favor, where he probably left some guaranteed money on the table by negotiating his own deal. Um, and that's the danger where I think with Williams, especially if he pans out to be who he's supposed to be, what is this second contract going to look like? And, how do you value yourself based on where the quarterback market could be in 4 years?
Yeah. I mean, shoot, look at Mahomes. Like the big, Mahomes has the biggest. No, who has the okay, big largest total money is Mahomes, right? He is like 400 million
Yeah, Mahomes is the largest contract. I believe the highest yearly is Dak.
yearly.
Um,
Yeah, I
I
believe it
believe
is
the
that.
highest salary cap hit is Dak.
Is that yeah?
Um, and that's part of the reason. Well, that's part of the reason I think the Cowboys should have done an extension with him because they could have lowered that number for this year. But the Cowboys, as usual, and it's nothing Jerry Jones hasn't done before. He plays with fire down there. So Dak will be playing on his last year. But not to get off topic, not having an agent going into the second contract can be detrimental, but it could have also been detrimental during the draft. If Caleb Williams was not the surefire number one overall pick, let's say there was some doubt or there was an actual number one B, like there is some most years there's a 1A and a 1B, and the team at number one
Yeah,
is deciding between these two guys. If
like
if
last
if
year with
one
Stroud and Young.
Yep. And if one B has an agent who's yapping to the two teams up top, where Caleb Williams is probably just in training and not making phone calls, there's leverage he could have lost there. Now, again, in his situation, he's the surefire number one coming out this year. There's no doubt he's head and shoulders the number one pick. Um, there was no doubt that he was going to be that guy. Um, but if there was, a competitor at 1B and an agent can be making calls to teams and discussing things with teams already, and talking to teams about just getting even to get a better relationship with the player. Those are things that Caleb, obviously without an agent is not going through because he's focusing on his training versus contacting teams, and that's what agents do during the combine period. They're talking to teams while their clients are in training. That way, the clients are not having to worry about that side of the business.
Yeah, exactly. And also just taking a look around at hey, who else might be looking at you? I mean, like unless it's a year like this where it was pretty much all but Chicago was gonna take Caleb Williams number one. You know, it wasn't like last year when Nick Casario had the sports world in mystery, because it's like,
Hmm.
oh well, there's word that they're going to that the Texans are going to trade the number one pick. Oh, well, now there's word that they won't even take a quarterback. They're going to go on the defensive side. Like Nick
Yep.
Casario really toyed with emotions last year. Ultimately ended up picking Stroud, but then get this, ended up trading with Arizona. We moved up, and then the very next pick got Will Anderson Jr. So now you got your quarterback of the
Yep.
future and your defender of the future in back-to-back picks. And Nick
Yep.
Casario had been the champion of the offseason.
Absolutely. The Texans orchestrated that very well, and then the one thing that I always remember is, and I don't think it's come up too much, but the whole Eli Manning situation. What if Caleb didn't want to play in Chicago? How
Right.
is he going to relay that to the Bears without an agent? And how is he going to finesse them to trade that pick knowing that he's going to hold out or not sign that contract, or his desire is not to play with the Bears? And his desires to play elsewhere. Those are situations where obviously having representation would have been beneficial. Um, and like I said like we said at the beginning, is he saving some money? Potentially. I think in the long run, it really depends, one, how he pans out. How many marketing deals does he possibly get shorted on because he doesn't have the negotiation skills, maybe as a representation would?
Mhm.
Or how many marketing deals have some stickling point in there that down the road he goes, oh shit. And it's things like that that you as a player, I don't think you should want to be worried about. Being your own representation and your own manager, and essentially now in these days, obviously, and then with the quarterback position, your own marketer.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, and it's funny because because Caleb Williams had actually expressed that he wasn't crazy going to Chicago like some time ago before the draft. So if he did have an agent, I wonder if he would have stuck to it. I wonder if he looked up and realized, you know what? I don't have an agent because I want to save some money. Maybe it's the cost effective route to give Chicago a shot. I might like it.
No, and they, on paper, I mean, they're a young team, but they should be a very competitive team with him at the helm. I like the receiving core they've built around him. I like what they did the rest of the draft in terms of putting some solid foundational pieces together. But yeah, it could have, if he really sat there and was like, I'm a California guy. Maybe I'd rather play for the Chargers. Um, and just an agent couldn't necessarily force them, but he could have definitely put the pressure on Chicago, like, hey, he's really going to be disgruntled if he ends up there.
Yeah.
He's not going to be happy. He's going to be a problem. And again, it would have been, for me, it would have been Eli, the closest thing to Eli Manning you would have seen, since then, in terms of, I'm not going to play here. I want to
Yeah.
play here type of thing. But with a player of that stature, I think the agent would have had some power to potentially finagle, depending who wanted to jump up. Because
Yeah.
that's the thing too, right? Chicago doesn't have to just go ahead and do it. It's their decision at the end of the day, just like it was Houston's decision to kind of dangle it out there, knowing probably full well at the end of the day, hey, we're going to take this quarterback, but we're not going to just be like, hey, we're going to just take the quarterback. Let's see who's going to offer us what, and we'll keep the fire going.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that would have been the biggest thing if Caleb was really expressing, where it would have been concerning for the Bears, like, oh man, do we want our first overall pick to hold out going into camp?
Yeah, I know, right?
Um,
Oh, remember Elway
that,
in '83? He
yep,
he refused to play for Baltimore Colts.
yeah, and a less known name, not known, less known name, but less statured quarterback, Alex Smith, his deal with the Niners got deal done at the very last minute. Um, and he was obviously a number one overall pick, and he had representation. Even with it, his deal got done at the very last second. But obviously, you know, back to Caleb, if he had any of those notions, obviously without an agent, it would have been very difficult because what are the what is he going to call the well I don't really want well why,
Yeah.
and then the best answer he's going to say is well I just don't want to be there. Well, what can we do? Where can we get you? We got to
Yeah.
see what we can do too, because you got to think that the Bears knew all season they were getting two top 10 picks pretty much.
Yeah.
and they were
Yeah.
having a chance to set themselves up for the future. And for a while, it looked like they were going to have number one and number two. People were talking they were going to get Caleb and Marvin Harrison Jr. You know, could you only imagine the two guys in the draft without an agent, and they could have ended up with both of them.
Well, both of them, yeah, which would have been crazy, because I mean, and even without an agent, him just saying, "Well, I just don't want to be here," like they really could been like assholes and been like, "Well, we drafted you, you're playing here."
Yep.
Now we'll see in 3, 4 years where you want to be at, but for now, you're playing in Chicago.
Yep. And then to touch on Harrison a little bit, he's the only player right now, at least as of last night. I haven't checked today. He's the only player as of right now that does not have his jersey for sale from the first round because he has not signed his NFL likeness deal. I don't know if that's because he doesn't have representation, but he has not signed that paperwork as of now. He eventually has to sign it. Um, it's not going to hurt him, obviously, financially. He's the number 4 overall pick. The jersey sales are going to be there regardless.
So
But it's interesting to see that he has not signed that deal. It's very, very, very rare for a player to go into the draft without that little piece of paper signed, giving your likeness over and things like that. So it'll be interesting to see. We touched on NCAA a couple of weeks ago. It brings me to memories of, Reggie Miller has not been in a basketball game since God knows when.
hmm
Um, and you wonder if Harrison never signs this piece of paper, does he not end up in Madden next year? Like, how far, is he allowed to, to take this and not sign this paper? How many, I'm not sure how long he's allowed to hold out on giving his likeness over to the NFL.
Yeah. I mean, for the longest time, Bill Belichick didn't give his likeness over. That's why whenever you would play the Madden games, it would always be
Yep.
Coach
New England
Patriots, and
coach.
it would be some dude on the sideline that looked nothing like Belichick. He had like blonde hair or something. Yeah. So, but man, that actually is all the time that we have, folks. Coming up here in about 5 minutes. It's going to be the Sideline Sports Show. JB Ellis, John Shear, Dave DeRocha, Rafael Esparza with the latest and greatest in this past week in sports. They're also going to talk about, who's your favorite athlete of all time and who's the most despised athlete of all time, along with some NBA updates for you. Again, we got a great game on TV. Got more coming up tonight. So for Sean Russi and I am Denzel Snipes, we will see you next week on Sports Business Insider. Shout out to everybody who tuned in. Later.